The nightmare always began the same way, the vast desert stretching endlessly before him, the taste of sand in his mouth, the weight of his helmet pressing down on his skull, and then the unmistakable silhouette appearing on the horizon, squat, angular, menacing, the T-55. Colonel William Steele bolted upright in bed, his cotton t-shirt soaked through with sweat, heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape. Beside him, Martha slept on, oblivious to the war raging in her husband's mind. 40 years of marriage had taught her to sleep through his midnight battles. Steele swung his legs over the side of the bed, feet finding the cool hardwood floor. 62 years old and still fighting a war that had ended decades ago. He checked the time, 03:27 hours. Old habits. In civilian life, it was just 3:27 a.m., but Steele had never fully left the military behind. He moved silently through the darkened house, a skill honed during countless night operations. Down the stairs, through the kitchen, and out the back door. The Nevada night was cool, stars brilliant in the clear desert sky. His destination stood before him, an oversized garage, separate from the house. Martha had insisted on that. "I won't have that thing connected to our home," she'd said when he'd brought it home. "That's your obsession, Bill, not mine." The padlock clicked to open. Steele flicked on the lights, revealing his project, his purpose, his penance. The T-55 Soviet main battle tank dominated the space, its olive green bulk incongruous in suburban Henderson. Parts lay organized on workbenches around it, tools hung in perfect order on pegboards. Military precision applied to retirement. "Hello, old enemy," Steele whispered, running a hand along the tank's cold steel flank. The T-55 had been stripped down, components cleaned, labeled, and methodically restored. The 100mm D10 T2S gun barrel had been removed for restoration, sitting on supports along the wall. The hatches stood open, revealing the cramped fighting compartment inside. To most, it would look like chaos, but to Steele, it was progress. 6 months of work already invested. He climbed up onto the hull, his knee protesting slightly. Old wounds never really healed. They just became part of you. Lowering himself into the commander's position, Steele settled into the familiar confines of a tank, though this one had been designed for a man much smaller than his 6'2" frame. He closed his eyes and suddenly he wasn't in Henderson anymore. Desert Storm, February 26, 1991. Captain William Steele commanded an M1A1 Abrams with the 3rd Armored Division during Operation Desert Storm. The 1st Brigade, known as the Iron Brigade, was advancing through the Iraqi desert, their objective to cut off Iraqi forces retreating from Kuwait. The morning air was crisp, visibility good. Steele had been awake for nearly 30 hours, running on adrenaline, instant coffee, and determination. His crew was the same: Gunner Sergeant Mike Tanner, Loader Corporal James Rodriguez, and Driver Private First Class Kevin Wilkins. They trained together for 3 years at this point. They weren't just a crew, they were brothers. "Contact, 2 o'clock, range 2,300 meters, Tanner called out, his eye fixed to the gunner's sight. Steele swiveled his commander's sight. There they were, a column of Iraqi armor moving north, the distinctive silhouette of T-55 tanks, at least a dozen of them. "Identify," Steele ordered. "T-55s, confirm T-55s, Tanner replied, voice steady. Steele keyed his radio. "Iron Horse 6, this is Iron 3-1, contact, multiple T-55s, Grid Sierra Echo 397426, request permission to engage. Iron 3-1, Iron Horse 6, you are cleared hot. Take them out." "Driver, stop," Steele ordered. The massive Abrams ground to a halt, its turbine engine idling with a distinctive whine. "Gunner, Sabot, T-55. Sabot, T-55, Tanner repeated, adjusting his sight. Rodriguez slammed the 100 piercing round into the breech. "Up! Fire! On the way!" The Abrams shuddered as the main gun fired, the report deafening even inside the tank. Through his sight, Steele watched the first T-55 erupt in flames, its turret blown clean off by the depleted uranium round. "Hit! Target destroyed! Driver forward! Gunner next target, tank same type." The Abrams surged forward, its 1,500 horsepower pushing 70 tons of American armor across the desert floor. The morning devolved into a blur of targets, fire commands, and destruction. The Iraqi T-55s, outmatched in every way, never stood a chance. Their rounds, when they managed to fire, couldn't penetrate the Abrams' composite armor. Meanwhile, the American tank's thermal sights, superior fire control, and devastating main gun made each shot a kill. Until the radio crackled with panic. Iron 3-1, this is Iron 3-4. We're hit! We're hit! Christ, the ammunition! The transmission cut off abruptly. Steele swiveled his sight. 200 meters to their right, another Abrams was burning, black smoke pouring from the turret. Lieutenant David Moore's tank, Steele's best friend since West Point. Driver, right 90 degrees, move, move, move. The Abrams pivoted sharply, racing toward the stricken tank. But even as they approached, Steele knew it was too late. When a tank's ammunition cooks off, the crew has seconds, not minutes, to escape. No one emerged from Iron 3-4's hatches. Then Steele spotted it, a lone T-55 hull down behind a small rise, its main gun trained on their position. It had somehow flanked the American advance and taken out Moore's tank with a lucky shot to the rear armor, or perhaps the ammunition compartment. Gunner tank, T-55, 11 o'clock, 600 meters, Steele shouted. Identified, Tanner replied, already traversing the turret. But the T-55 fired first. The 100mm round struck the frontal armor of Steele's Abrams, failing to penetrate but rocking the 70-ton beast with the impact. Load Sabot! Sabot loaded! Fire! On the way! The 120mm round tore through the air, striking the T-55 dead center. The Soviet-designed tank didn't explode dramatically like in the movies. Instead, it simply stopped. A hole punched clean through its frontal armor. The crew inside obliterated instantly. Steele stared at the smoking hulk of the T-55 through his sight. One tank, one obsolete, outmatched Soviet export model had managed to kill 4 Americans, including David Moore, before being destroyed. In that moment, something changed in William Steele. A seed of obsession was planted, one that would grow for decades to come. Back in his garage in Henderson, Steele opened his eyes, the memories receding like the tide. His hand rested on the gunner's position of the same tank, the same exact T-55 that had killed Moore and his crew. The tank that haunted his dreams and now occupied his waking hours. What Martha didn't know, what no one knew, was that this specific T-55 wasn't just any Soviet tank. This was the tank that had killed his best friend, the tank he had destroyed minutes later, the tank that, through a series of unlikely events, bureaucratic mix-ups, and Steele's own pulling of strings, had ended up here, in his garage, 32 years later. He'd never told Martha this truth. How could he explain that he'd spent years tracking down the specific tank that had caused him so much pain? How could he make her understand that restoring it wasn't an obsession with the enemy, but a form of exorcism? The truth would sound insane to anyone who hadn't been there. Maybe it was insane, but Steele couldn't stop now, not when he was so close to completion. He climbed out of the tank and checked his watch again. Almost 4 o'clock a.m. Too early to start working without waking Martha with the noise, but too late to go back to sleep. Instead, he pulled a folding chair from against the wall and sat facing the tank, a general contemplating his opponent across the battlefield. "What am I doing with you?" he whispered to the inanimate steel beast. "What am I trying to prove?" The tank, of course, didn't answer. But in the silence of the pre-dawn, Steele thought he could almost hear the voices of those who had crewed it, the Iraqi soldiers who had died inside when his own round had torn through their world. Morning light filtered through the garage windows when Martha found him there, still sitting, still watching the tank as if it might suddenly reveal some long-held secret. "Bill," she said from the doorway, her voice carefully neutral, "have you been out here all night again?" Steele straightened, military-bearing automatic even after all these years. "Just a few hours. Couldn't sleep." Martha nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. At 60, she was still beautiful to him, her blonde hair now silver, the lines around her eyes and mouth earned through decades of being a military wife, raising their children often alone, managing their lives during his deployments, and now dealing with a husband who seemed more interested in a machine of war than in building their retirement together. "The Hendersons invited us over for dinner tonight," she said. "I told them we'd be there." Steele nodded. The Hendersons, civilian neighbors, normal people with normal retirements, talking about grandchildren and golf scores. Not tanks, not war, not the past. "I'll be ready," he said. Martha lingered in the doorway. "Bill, Dr. Kaufman called yesterday. He said you missed your appointment again." The VA psychiatrist. Mandatory sessions for his PTSD, a condition Steele refused to acknowledge despite the nightmares, the flashbacks, the hypervigilance that had never really gone away. "I forgot," he lied. "No, you didn't. Martha's voice hardened slightly. You're avoiding him because he told you this project isn't healthy. She gestured at the tank. He said you're not processing your trauma, you're reliving it. Steele stood up, stretching his stiff back. Kaufman doesn't understand. Then help me understand, Bill, because I'm watching my husband disappear into this garage, into the past, and I don't know how to bring you back. The raw pain in her voice cut through Steele's defenses. For a moment, he considered telling her everything about the nightmares, about why this specific tank mattered so much. But the words caught in his throat, trapped behind decades of military stoicism. I need to shower, he said instead, moving past her toward the house. Martha caught his arm as he passed. Bill, this can't go on. You spending every waking hour with that thing. Us barely talking. You refusing help. Steele looked down at her hand on his arm, then into her eyes. I need more time, he said quietly. I'm close to finishing it. And then what? Martha challenged. What happens when it's done? Will you drive it down the street? Put it on our lawn? What's the end game here, Bill? It was a fair question, one he'd asked himself countless times. What was he trying to accomplish? Restoration wasn't the right word. This wasn't about bringing the tank back to life. This was about what? I don't know yet, he admitted, but I will. Martha released his arm, her expression a mixture of frustration and resignation. Bill, I've supported you through everything. Desert Storm, Kosovo, Iraq again, Afghanistan, 35 years of deployments, moves, raising our kids often alone. I never complained because that was the life we chose together. She took a deep breath, but this isn't what I signed up for in retirement. You need help, and if you won't get it, if this tank means more to you than our future together, then I don't know if I can stay. The ultimatum hung in the air between them, heavy as armor plate. Martha, no, she cut him off. Don't answer now. Think about it. Really think, Bill. Either sell this thing and start therapy again, for real this time, or I'm going to my sister's in Phoenix. She turned and walked back to the house, leaving Steele standing in the doorway of the garage, caught between the life he'd built with Martha and the past he couldn't escape. Inside the house, Steele showered mechanically, his mind elsewhere. Martha's ultimatum wasn't entirely unexpected. Their marriage had been strained since his retirement 3 years ago. 30 years of military service had defined him so completely that civilian life felt like exile. Without the structure, the purpose, the brotherhood of the Army, Steele had floundered, growing increasingly withdrawn. The tank project had initially seemed like the perfect solution. It gave him purpose, structure, and connected him to his military past. But what had started as restoration had evolved into obsession, consuming more and more of his time and thoughts. As he dressed, Steele glanced at the photos on the bedroom wall. Their wedding in 1988, him in his dress uniform, Martha radiant in white. The birth of their son, James, now a captain following in his father's footsteps, currently deployed with the 1st Armored Division in Europe. Their daughter, Sarah, a trauma surgeon in Seattle, her career choice undoubtedly influenced by growing up watching her father deploy to war zones. His children barely called anymore. James was busy with his own military career, and Sarah had made it clear she thought her father needed professional help, not a tank restoration project. Downstairs, Martha had made coffee but was nowhere to be seen. A note on the counter informed him she'd gone grocery shopping and would be back later. The distance between them stretched wider every day. With nowhere else to go, Steele found himself driving to the VA Medical Center. Not for his missed psychiatric appointment, but for a weekly gathering he actually did attend faithfully, the Desert Storm Veteran Support Group. The group met in a sterile conference room, a dozen men and 2 women, all in their 60s now, all carrying the visible and invisible scars of that long-ago conflict. They nodded to Steele as he entered. No one asked why he was there on the wrong day. They understood the need for sanctuary among those who had shared the same experiences. Colonel, greeted Sam Wilson, a former Marine who'd lost his left leg to an Iraqi landmine. Didn't expect to see you today. Thought I'd stop by, Steele replied, taking a seat in the circle of chairs. The group's facilitator, Dr. Lena Chen, a VA psychologist in her 40s, studied him with professional interest. We were just discussing coping mechanisms, Colonel Steele. Perhaps you'd like to share yours? Steele shifted uncomfortably. He attended these meetings to listen, not to talk. But today, with Martha's ultimatum weighing on him, perhaps talking was what he needed. I restore things, he said after a moment. Military vehicles, equipment, currently working on a tank. A therapeutic activity, Dr. Chen nodded, using familiar military equipment as a bridge between your service and civilian life. Something like that, Steele agreed, not mentioning the specific tank or his true motivations. Have you considered writing about your experiences? Dr. Chen suggested. Many veterans find that narrative therapy, telling their story, helps organize traumatic memories into a coherent structure. I'm not much of a writer, Steele demurred. Doesn't have to be for publication, Sam interjected. Been keeping a journal myself. Just writing down what happened, how I felt then, how I feel now, helps sort things out. History gets lost if we don't record it, added Eleanor Winters, a former Army nurse. Our grandkids won't know what it was like unless we tell them. Dr. Chen smiled encouragingly. Why not try writing about that tank you're restoring? Its history, your connection to it, might give you some perspective. Perspective. That's what Martha said he lacked. Maybe there was something to this idea. After the meeting, Steele stopped at an office supply store and purchased a leather-bound journal. Back home, with Martha still out, he returned to the garage, pulled up a chair next to the workbench, and opened to the first blank page. What to write? The full truth seemed too raw, too personal. But he could start with the tank itself, its history, its development. Facts were easier than feelings. The T-55, he wrote, began life as an evolution of the T-54, itself descended from the legendary T-34-85 of World War II fame. The words came easier than expected. Steele had spent years studying Soviet armor, first as an enemy to defeat, then as a subject of professional interest. He wrote about the T-34-85, the Soviet medium tank that had helped crush Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front, how its sloped armor and powerful 85mm gun had revolutionized tank design worldwide. He described the T-44, the often overlooked intermediate design that introduced two revolutionary features still found in modern Russian tanks: torsion bar suspension and a transverse engine mounting to save space. He detailed how the first prototype of what would become the T-54 had rolled out of the Nizhny Tagil plant on January 30th, 1945, before World War II had even ended. As he wrote, Steele found himself including personal asides. His father, a Korean War veteran, had faced T-34-85s with the Chinese forces, describing them as tough as nails compared to our Shermans. How Steele himself had grown up building model tanks, memorizing their specifications, knowing even then he was destined for the armor branch. The journal became a conversation between past and present, between technical specifications and personal recollections. Without consciously intending to, Steele began drawing parallels between his own life and the tank's development. The T-55, he wrote, emerged from conflict, was continuously adapted to changing circumstances, proved more durable than anyone expected, and now in its later years struggles to find relevance in a world that has moved on to newer, more advanced models. He paused, pen hovering over the page, struck by the inadvertent self-portrait he'd just created. Wasn't that his own story as well? Born during the Cold War, career shaped by constant adaptation to changing theaters and threats, now struggling to find purpose in retirement? The garage door opened behind him. Martha stood there, grocery bags in hand, looking at him with surprise. Writing? She asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Steele closed the journal, suddenly self-conscious. Just some notes on the restoration, he half lied. Martha set the groceries down on a clear spot on the workbench. Dr. Chen called, said you stopped by the VA today. Just for the support group, Steele clarified, not wanting her to think he'd made the psychiatrist appointment after all. Martha nodded, studying him. She suggested I give you space to work through things your own way. Said sometimes soldiers need to approach their trauma obliquely. Smart woman, Steele said. She also said if you weren't showing improvement in a month, I should drag you to therapy myself, Martha added, the ghost of a smile playing at her lips. Despite himself, Steele chuckled. That sounds more realistic. Martha's expression softened slightly. Dinner's at 7. The Hendersons are looking forward to seeing us. She turned to go, then stopped. I meant what I said this morning, Bill. Something needs to change, but I'm glad you're writing. It's a start. After she left, Steele returned to his journal, flipping back through what he'd written. The history of Soviet tank development, intertwined with his own history. Two parallel tracks, now converging in his garage. On impulse, he pulled open the drawer of the workbench where he kept documents related to the tank. maintenance manuals, technical specifications, and his own service records. As he sorted through them, a faded envelope fell out from between the pages of a field manual. Steele froze, recognizing the handwriting immediately. The letter he'd never been able to bring himself to reread. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of its contents more acutely than the paper itself. Lieutenant David Moore had given each of his closest friends a sealed letter before they deployed to Desert Storm. "Just in case," he'd said with characteristic dark humor, "open it if I don't make it back." Steele had opened it once, the day after Moore's tank had been destroyed. He'd read it through tears, then sealed it away with his grief, unable to face it again. Until now. With trembling fingers, he extracted the letter from the envelope. "Bill," it began in Moore's precise handwriting, "if you're reading this, I guess I pulled the short straw. First round's on me when we meet again, but hopefully not for a long time." Steele's vision blurred. He blinked rapidly, forcing himself to continue. "We've talked about this moment, you and I, over too many beers. The possibility that one of us might not make it home. It's part of the job. But here's what I need you to know. Whatever happened, it wasn't your fault. In this business, sometimes the best training, the best equipment, and the best soldiers still lose to bad luck or fate or whatever you want to call it. I've had a good run. West Point, Armor Branch, serving with my best friend. No regrets. But you, Bill Steele, you're destined for stars on your shoulders. Don't let whatever happened to me derail that. Don't carry me as a weight. Carry me as fuel. And when you're an old man with grandkids on your knee, tell them about your buddy Dave who loved tanks, practical jokes, and Johnny Cash, in that order. Tell them I died doing exactly what I wanted to be doing with the brothers I chose. One last thing, remember our pact from senior year? To live a life big enough for both of us if one didn't make it? Well, collection time, brother. Live twice as fully, love twice as deeply, laugh twice as often. Until we meet again at Fiddler's Green, where all good cavalrymen go, your friend always, Dave." Steele lowered the letter, his cheeks wet. The pact, he'd completely forgotten their drunken promise, made the night before graduation. How had he forgotten something so important? But he knew how. In his grief and guilt over Moore's death, he'd locked away not just the painful memories, but the good ones too. And somewhere along the way, he'd stopped living for both of them. He'd survived, advanced in his career, raised a family. But had he truly lived as Moore had asked? Had he embraced life with twice the passion, twice the purpose? The answer was painfully clear. Not only had he failed to honor their pact, but now, in retirement, he'd retreated further, hiding in his garage with the very instrument of Moore's death, alienating his wife, distancing himself from his children. What would Moore think of him now? The realization hit Steele like a physical blow. He'd spent decades believing he was haunted by Moore's death, but the truth was far worse. He'd betrayed Moore's final request. Instead of living fully enough for two men, he'd barely been living at all. He looked up at the T-55, seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't exorcism. This wasn't healing. This was self-imposed purgatory, a prison of steel and memories. Steele carefully folded Moore's letter and returned it to the envelope. Then he picked up his journal and began to write again, this time with brutal honesty about Moore, about the battle, about the 30 years since. Hours passed. The journal filled with words, some carefully considered, others scrawled in emotional haste. When he finally set down his pen, the shadows in the garage had lengthened, and his hand was cramped from writing. He checked his watch. 6:15 p.m. Less than an hour until dinner at the Hendersons. Steele stood, his joints protesting after hours of stillness. As he made his way toward the house, he cast one last look at the T-55. "I'm not finished with you yet," he told the tank. "But maybe it's time we both found a new purpose." Inside the house, he found Martha in their bedroom, putting the finishing touches on her makeup. She glanced at him in the mirror as he entered. "You need to shower again," she said, noting his disheveled appearance. "And hurry, we can't be late." Steele nodded, but instead of heading to the bathroom, he sat on the edge of the bed. "Martha, we need to talk." She turned to face him, wariness in her eyes. "About?" "About everything. About why I can't let go of that tank. About Desert Storm. About David Moore." Martha's expression softened. She'd known Moore and his wife, had attended his funeral, had watched Steele retreat into himself afterward. "Bill, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted gently. "I should have done this years ago." Martha sat beside him, taking his hand. "We have time before dinner." "No." Steele shook his head. Not now, not rushed, but soon. Tomorrow, I promise. Martha studied his face, perhaps searching for signs of deflection or delay. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her because she nodded. Tomorrow, then. Steele squeezed her hand. There's something else. That specific T-55 in our garage. It's not just any Soviet tank. What do you mean? He took a deep breath. It's the actual tank that killed Moore, the one I destroyed minutes later. Martha's eyes widened. My God, Bill, how? Why? It's a long story, Steele sighed. Part of what we'll talk about tomorrow. But I wanted you to know now because I've made a decision. What decision? I'm going to finish restoring it, but not for me, for a purpose Dave would have approved of. Martha waited, her expression unreadable. There's a military museum in Carson City that's been after me to donate my collection of memorabilia, Steele continued. I'm going to offer them the T-55 when it's complete, with one condition. They create an educational exhibit around it, not glorifying war, but teaching about it, about the human cost, about the men inside these machines. He paused, gathering his thoughts. And I'll go back to Dr. Kaufman, for real this time. Martha's eyes glistened with unshed tears. What changed today? Steele thought about Moore's letter, about their forgotten pact, about the decades spent carrying guilt instead of living fully. I remembered a promise I made, he said simply, a promise to live a life big enough for two. Martha leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. That sounds like the Bill Steele I married. They sat together in companionable silence until the alarm on Martha's phone chimed, reminding them of their dinner engagement. We should get ready, she said, rising. The Hendersons are waiting. Steele nodded, standing as well. Martha, thank you for not giving up on me. Never, she replied softly. But I'm glad you haven't given up on yourself either. As Steele showered and dressed for dinner, his mind was clearer than it had been in years. The T-55 would always be part of his story, a chapter he couldn't erase. But perhaps now it could become something more. A bridge between past and future, between memory and healing, between war and understanding. Moore would have approved. He'd always said that the best armor wasn't the inches of steel protecting a tank, but the lessons learned from surviving the battles within and without. Tomorrow, Steele would begin sharing those lessons, starting with Martha. It wouldn't be easy, but as any tank commander knew, the most important terrain to capture was the high ground. And for the first time in decades, Colonel William Steele felt ready to advance. Colonel William Steele sat across from Dr. Nathan Kaufman in the VA psychiatrist's office, the silence stretching between them like a no-man's land. Steele had kept his promise to Martha. He'd made the appointment the morning after their conversation. But now, sitting here, he found himself unable to speak. You missed our last 3 sessions, Dr. Kaufman said finally. A man in his 50s with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he had the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to waiting out silences. What brings you back today? Steele cleared his throat. My wife, only your wife. And a promise, Steele added, thinking of David Moore's letter. An old one I'd forgotten. Dr. Kaufman nodded, making a brief note. Last time we spoke, you were starting work on a tank restoration project. How's that going? It's why I'm here, Steele admitted. The tank. It's not just any tank. Tell me about it. So Steele did. Haltingly at first, then with increasing fluidity, he explained about the T-55 in his garage, about David Moore, about Desert Storm and the 32 years since, about finding Moore's letter and remembering their pact. Dr. Kaufman listened without interruption, his expression neutral but attentive. When Steele finally fell silent, the psychiatrist set down his notepad. That's quite a story, Colonel, he said, and a significant step, sharing it. Where do you want to go from here? Steele hadn't expected this question. In the military, next steps were clear. Objectives, strategies, execution. But healing? He had no roadmap for that territory. I don't know, he admitted. I just know I can't keep living like this. Dr. Kaufman leaned forward slightly. You've been carrying this burden for over 30 years, Colonel. It won't be resolved in a single session, but I think we have a starting point now. Which is? Understanding that your relationship with this tank is complex. It's not just about your friend's death or your survivor's guilt. It's about finding meaning in loss, purpose in survival. Steele considered this. I promised Martha I'd sell the tank. Is that what you want to do? No, Steele answered honestly. But I told her about my plan to restore it for the museum, an educational exhibit. Dr. Kaufman nodded thoughtfully. That sounds like a meaningful compromise, a way to honor both your commitment to Martha and to your friend's memory. But is it enough? Steele asked, voicing the doubt that had plagued him since making the decision. Finishing the restoration, donating it, then what? Back to puttering around the house, golfing with retirees who've never seen combat? That's not living a life big enough for two. What would be, Dr. Kaufman asked, if you could design your next chapter, what would make it worthy of that promise? The question lingered with Steele as he left the VA. What would make his life worthy of more sacrifice? Of their pact? He had no answer yet, but for the first time in years, he was actively seeking one. Driving home, Steele took a detour. Instead of heading back to Henderson, he found himself on the highway toward Nellis Air Force Base. He hadn't planned this visit, but something pulled him there. Some need to reconnect with the military world he'd left behind. At the main gate, he presented his retired military ID. The young Air Force Security Forces airman snapped to attention when he saw Steele's rank. "Good afternoon, Colonel. What brings you to Nellis today, sir?" "Just visiting," Steele replied vaguely. "Is Colonel Jackson still commanding the 99th? "Yes, sir. Would you like me to call ahead?" Steele considered this. Robert Jackson was an old colleague, a fellow tanker who transferred to the Air Force years ago. They hadn't spoken in at least 5 years. "No, thank you. I'll just drive through if that's permitted." "Of course, sir. Thank you for your service." As Steele drove on to the base, memories washed over him. Not of combat this time, but of community. The structured routine of military life. The camaraderie. The sense of belonging to something larger than himself. He parked near the officers' club and sat in his car, watching young officers and NCOs go about their day. Had he ever been that young? That unburdened? He must have been once before Desert Storm, before Moore's death, before the weight of command and the toll of multiple deployments had carved permanent furrows in his soul. His phone rang, interrupting his reverie. "Martha." "Where are you?" she asked when he answered. "I thought you'd be home after your appointment." "I took a drive," Steele replied. "Ended up at Nellis. Just thinking." Martha's voice softened. "How was the session? Helpful? Difficult?" He paused. "I told him everything, about the tank, about Moore. I'm proud of you, Bill." A simple statement, but it landed like a medal on Steele's chest. When was the last time someone had been proud of him? When was the last time he'd done something worthy of pride? "I'll be home soon," he promised. "Take your time," Martha said. "I'm meeting Sarah for lunch. She's in town for a medical conference." Steele felt a pang of regret. Their daughter, so accomplished, so distant. "Tell her I said hello. Why don't you join us? She'd love to see you." Would she? Steele wondered. Their relationship had grown strained over the years. Sarah, a trauma surgeon, had seen too many parallels between her father's untreated PTSD and the wounded soldiers who crossed her operating table. "Next time," he said, "I have some things to take care of." After hanging up, Steele did something impulsive. He drove to the base museum, a small facility showcasing Nellis's history and the evolution of Air Force combat capabilities. As he walked through the exhibits, he found himself studying not just the aircraft and weapons on display, but how they were presented, the narratives constructed around them, the stories they told. An idea began to form in his mind, nebulous at first, then gaining definition. The T-55 wasn't just a tank to him, it was a vessel containing a story. His story, Moore's story, the story of warfare and its human cost. If properly told, couldn't that story serve a purpose greater than his private obsession? His phone rang again, an unfamiliar number with a European country code. "Colonel Steele speaking," he answered automatically. "Dad, it's James." Steele's heart leapt at the sound of his son's voice. "James, where are you calling from?" "Germany. Can't say exactly where. How are you? How's Mom?" "We're fine," Steele replied, moving to a quieter corner of the museum. "Your mother's having lunch with Sarah today. How's your deployment?" A pause. "Interesting. That's why I'm calling. Actually, I need your expertise." "My expertise?" Steele repeated, surprised. James had never sought his professional advice before. Like many sons of accomplished fathers, he'd carved his own path, rarely acknowledging his father's influence on his career choice. "Yeah, you're still the Army's foremost expert on Soviet-era armor, right? Specifically the T-55? Steele felt a chill run down his spine. "I was once. Been retired 3 years now. Why do you ask?" James lowered his voice, though the international connection made it hard to hear him clearly anyway. "We're preparing for a training mission. Can't give details over an unsecure line, but it involves familiarizing certain Allied forces with Soviet-era equipment they might encounter." "Ukrainian forces," Steele stated flatly. It wasn't a question. "You didn't hear that from me," James replied. "But yes, And specifically, they need to know how to maximize the effectiveness of the T-55s they've been given by other NATO countries. These are tankers who've trained on more modern equipment, now having to operate tanks from the 1960s against an adversary with more advanced capabilities. Steele found himself nodding, his mind already cycling through the tactical implications. The T-55 can still be effective if used properly. Its low profile makes it good for ambush positions. The 100mm gun is outdated, but can still damage modern tanks from the side or rear at close range. That's exactly the kind of insight we need, James said. Dad, would you be willing to consult? Officially, through proper channels. We need someone who really understands these machines, not just technically, but tactically. Someone who's faced them in combat. Steele fell silent, his mind racing. The request was unexpected, but not unwelcome. It awakened something in him, a sense of purpose, of continued service. I need to think about it, he said finally. Talk to your mother. Of course, James replied. But if you're interested, I'll have the right people contact you. Everything above board, all clearances in order. After promising to consider it, Steele ended the call, his thoughts in turmoil. The coincidence seemed almost supernatural, finding Moore's letter, recommitting to therapy, and now this offer, all within days of each other. Was fate trying to tell him something? He left the museum and drove home in a daze, barely registering the familiar streets of Henderson as he navigated back to their subdivision. By the time he pulled into the driveway, Martha's car was already there. He found her in the kitchen, preparing dinner. How was lunch with Sarah? He asked, kissing her cheek. Good. She sends her love. Martha studied his face. Something's happened. What is it? Steele had never been able to hide anything from her. James called. Martha's eyes widened. Is he all right? He's fine, in Germany. Steele took a deep breath. He wants me to consult on a project. Something to do with T-55 tanks and training Ukrainian forces. Martha set down the knife she'd been using to chop vegetables. Consult how? Where? I don't know all the details yet. It would be official, through the Pentagon. I'd be a civilian contractor. Would you have to go to Europe? I don't know, Steele admitted. Maybe. Probably at some point. Martha turned away, resuming her chopping with more force than necessary. I see. I haven't said yes, Steele clarified. I told him I needed to talk to you first. And if I say I don't want you to do it? Martha asked, her back still to him. Steele approached her, gently turning her to face him. Then I won't do it. We're a team, Martha. I'm done making unilateral decisions. She searched his face, looking for deception and finding none. You want to do it, though, I can tell. Yes, he admitted, but not at the cost of us. Not anymore. Martha sighed, setting down the knife again. It's just, I thought we were moving forward. You finally opened up, agreed to therapy, made plans for the tank, and now, suddenly, you might be going back into that world again? The world that nearly broke you? It's different this time, Steele said, trying to articulate why this opportunity felt important. I wouldn't be commanding troops or making life or death decisions. I'd be sharing knowledge, experience, maybe helping save lives. Ukrainian lives, Martha nodded, and that matters to you. Yes, but also American lives. James is over there, Martha, our son. If there's anything I can do to help him and his men navigate this situation safely. Martha's expression softened at the mention of their son. I know. It's just hard to think of you diving back into all of that again, especially now when you're finally dealing with your PTSD. Maybe this is part of dealing with it, Steele suggested. Dr. Kaufman asked me what would make my life worthy of more sacrifice. What would fulfill our pact to live a life big enough for two? This feels like it could be part of that answer. Martha studied him for a long moment. Promise me something, she said finally. Anything. Promise you'll keep going to therapy, that you won't use this as an excuse to stop dealing with the past. Steele took her hands in his. I promise. And promise you'll be honest with me. No more secrets. No more suffering in silence. I promise that too. Martha nodded slowly. Then, if they offer it, and if you want to do it, you have my support. Steele pulled her into an embrace, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. Not just about the potential consulting job, but about their relationship. For the first time in years, they were truly communicating, truly partnering. Thank you, he whispered into her hair. Over dinner, they discussed the possibilities more concretely. What such a consulting role might entail, how long it might last, whether it would involve travel. If I do need to go to Europe, Steele said, would you consider coming with me? Not to the training sites, of course, but maybe staying in Germany or Poland while I work. We could explore Europe together afterward. Martha looked surprised. You'd want me to come? Of course, Steele replied, realizing with shame how much their marriage had deteriorated if she found this unexpected. I've spent too much of our life together leaving you behind. I don't want to do that anymore. A small smile played at the corners of Martha's mouth. I've always wanted to see Prague. Then we'll see Prague, Steele promised. After dinner, they moved to the living room. Martha began knitting, a hobby she'd taken up after retiring from her teaching career, while Steele opened his laptop to research the current situation in Ukraine. He wanted to be prepared if the Pentagon did reach out. He'd been reading for about an hour when his phone rang. Another international number, but not James this time. Colonel Steele, he answered. Colonel, this is Major General Howard Phillips, United States European Command. Steele straightened instinctively at the sound of a general officer's voice. Good evening, sir. I'll get right to the point, Colonel. Your son, Captain Steele, suggested you might be able to assist us with a specialized training program. I understand you're something of an expert on Soviet-era armor, particularly the T-55 series. I have significant experience with them, yes, sir. Good. We need that expertise, Colonel. Our Ukrainian partners have received a shipment of modernized T-55s from several NATO allies. These are upgraded versions, T-55 AM2s from the Czech Republic, M55S models from Slovenia with NATO standard 105mm guns. The Ukrainians need to integrate these platforms into their defensive operations ASAP. Steele's mind was already analyzing the tactical implications. The Slovenian M55S, with its British L7 105mm gun, the same weapon mounted on the Centurion and early models of the Abrams, could be particularly effective. A fascinating irony that the T-55 would now be armed with its former adversary's main weapon. I understand, sir. How can I help? We're assembling a training team, combination of active duty personnel and civilian specialists. Two-phase operation, initial assessment and planning at the Pentagon, followed by deployment to our training facility in Germany to work directly with Ukrainian tank crews. Your role would be advisory, helping develop tactical guidelines for employing these older tanks effectively against more modern threats. Timeline, sir? Initial phase begins next week in Washington. Deployment to Germany approximately 3 weeks after that. Duration to be determined, but likely 2 to 3 months. Steele glanced at Martha, who had stopped knitting to listen. She gave him a slight nod. I'm interested, sir. What's the next step? Excellent. I'll have my staff send over the necessary paperwork. We'll need you in Washington by Monday. Civilian contractor status, appropriate security clearances, which I understand you still maintain. After confirming a few more details, the call ended. Steele sat in silence, absorbing the sudden shift in his life's trajectory. Washington on Monday, Martha said. That's 4 days from now. Yes. Steele met her gaze. Are you sure you're okay with this? Martha set her knitting aside. I married a soldier, Bill. I've always understood what that means. She paused. And honestly, I'd rather see you engaged with something meaningful than obsessing over that tank in the garage. The tank. In the excitement of James's call and General Phillips's offer, Steele had momentarily forgotten about the T-55 restoration project. I still plan to finish it, he said, for the museum, but it might have to wait until after this assignment. Martha nodded. It's waited 30 years. It can wait a few more months. The next morning, Steele received an encrypted email package from General Phillips' staff containing the necessary paperwork and preliminary briefing materials. As he reviewed them at his home office desk, the scope of the mission became clearer. The Ukrainian military had received approximately 90 upgraded T-55 variants from various NATO countries. These were not frontline tanks. Those slots were filled by more modern Western donations like Leopards, Challengers, and Abrams. Instead, the T-55s would serve in secondary roles, infantry support, defensive positions, and as mobile artillery platforms. The key challenge was adapting Ukrainian tank doctrine, developed for their native T-64s and T-72s, to these older but modernized platforms. The T-55, even upgraded, required different tactical approaches. It had thinner armor, a less sophisticated fire control system, and more limited crew visibility. But it also had advantages: a lower profile, mechanical simplicity, and in some upgraded variants, surprisingly effective firepower. As Steele immersed himself in the technical specifications, Martha entered with a cup of coffee. You look in your element, she observed, setting the mug beside him. Steele glanced up, realizing he'd been completely absorbed in the work for hours. It feels good, purposeful. Martha leaned against the desk. I spoke with Sarah this morning, told her about your new project. Steele tensed slightly. Their daughter had never approved of his continued connection to military affairs. What did she say? She was surprised, but she also said, Martha paused, choosing her words carefully. She said maybe this is what you need. Structure, purpose, a chance to help rather than just remember. Steele felt a wave of gratitude toward his daughter. Perhaps there was hope for healing that relationship too. She also wants to have dinner tomorrow night, Martha continued, before you leave for Washington. I'd like that, Steele said sincerely. As Martha left him to his work, Steele's phone chimed with a text message from an unknown number. Secure line established. Call when able. James. Steele checked his watch. Just after 0900 in Nevada, meaning early evening in Germany, he dialed the number. Captain Steele, his son answered formally, though Steele could hear the smile in his voice. Captain, Steele replied, matching the formality. I received the briefing package from General Phillips this morning. Good. What do you think? Ambitious timeline, complex mission parameters, but feasible with the right approach. James chuckled. Some things never change. You always did prefer the technical assessment before the personal conversation. Steele felt a pang of regret at his son's observation. Had he always been so rigidly professional, even with his own children? How are you, son? He asked, consciously softening his tone. Really? A pause. Busy, stressed, proud of what we're doing here, but it's complicated. War always is, Steele agreed. Not just the war, James clarified. Working with the Ukrainians. They're incredible soldiers, resourceful, determined, but they're fighting for their homes, their families. The stakes for them are existential. Makes our job both more meaningful and more, humbling. Steele understood. He'd felt something similar during his deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. The weight of knowing that, while he would eventually go home, the local populations had no such luxury. Their entire way of life hung in the balance. I'm glad you'll be joining the team, Dad, James continued. These Ukrainian tankers deserve the best training we can give them, and when it comes to making the most of older tanks against superior enemy forces, there's no one better. The compliment warmed Steele unexpectedly. Thank you, son. That means a lot. I have to go now. Briefing in 5 minutes. But I'll see you in Germany, right? Count on it, Steele promised. After they hung up, Steele leaned back in his chair, a complex mixture of emotions washing over him. Pride in his son's service, anticipation of their upcoming work together, apprehension about returning to the world of military operations, even in an advisory capacity. And beneath it all, a nagging question. Was he doing this for the right reasons? To help the Ukrainians? To reconnect with his son? Or was he seeking to recapture something of his former self? The Colonel Steele who knew exactly who he was and what he was meant to do. Dr. Kaufman's question echoed in his mind. If you could design your next chapter, what would make it worthy of that promise? Perhaps this mission was part of the answer, but Steele sensed there was more to discover about himself, about his relationship with the past, about what it truly meant to live a life big enough for two. His contemplation was interrupted by the doorbell. Steele checked the security camera feed on his phone, surprised to see a man in his 30s wearing a UPS uniform but no visible package. Cautious by nature and training, Steele approached the front door warily. Can I help you? He called through the door. Colonel William Steele? The man asked, his accent distinctly Middle Eastern. Who's asking? My name is Tariq al-Saman, the man replied. I believe you and I have a connection you might find significant. Steele tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward the small of his back where he'd once carried his service weapon. What connection is that? February 26, 1991, Desert Storm. The man's voice remained calm. A T-55 tank, the one currently in your garage. Steele's blood ran cold. How could this stranger possibly know about the tank? About its significance? What do you want? Steele demanded. Just to talk, Colonel, Al-Saman replied. About my father. He was the commander of that tank. For a moment, Steele couldn't breathe. The commander of the T-55 that had killed Moore. The man whose tank Steele had destroyed with a single 120mm round. The man he'd obliterated without ever seeing his face. With trembling fingers, Steele unlocked and opened the door. Tariq al-Saman stood on the porch, no longer in the UPS uniform, but dressed in simple civilian clothes and jeans and a button-down shirt. He was of average height with olive skin, dark hair graying slightly at the temples, and eyes that held both wariness and determination. "How did you find me?" Steele asked. "It wasn't easy," Asaman admitted, "but I've been searching for years. After the fall of Baghdad in 2003, many military records became accessible. I found documents about the engagement where my father died. Your name was in the after-action report." Steele's tactical mind quickly assessed the situation. The man appeared unarmed, his posture wasn't threatening, and if he'd wanted revenge, showing up at the front door announced wasn't a logical approach. "Come in," Steele said finally, stepping aside. Al-Saman entered cautiously, his eyes taking in the military memorabilia decorating the entryway. Photographs of Steele in uniform, shadow boxes containing medals, unit insignia mounted in frames. "Your father was an Iraqi tank commander," Steele stated as he led the visitor to the living room. "Yes," Al-Saman confirmed, taking a seat when Steele gestured to the couch. "Captain Faisal Al-Saman, 6th Armored Division Iraqi Republican Guard." Steele sat opposite him, studying the man's face for any resemblance to the enemy he'd never seen. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said formally, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. Al-Saman nodded acknowledgement. "I was 12 when he died. We were told he was killed heroically in battle against the Americans. It wasn't until years later that I learned the full story, or parts of it at least." "What brings you here after all this time?" Steele asked. "And how do you know about the tank in my garage?" "I live in Phoenix now," Al-Saman explained. "U.S. citizen since 2011. I work as an interpreter for the government and military. 2 years ago, I was at Fort Irwin, translating for a training exercise with Iraqi officers. One of them knew my father and mentioned seeing a T-55 with my father's unit markings at a U.S. military storage facility." He leaned forward, eyes intense. "I've been tracking it ever since. When it was sold at auction last year, I lost the trail until a curator at the Patton Museum mentioned a Colonel Steele had acquired it for restoration." Steele felt exposed, vulnerable in a way combat had never made him feel. This man, the son of the enemy commander he'd killed, had been searching for him, had found him, was sitting in his living room discussing a shared history neither of them had experienced firsthand, but that had shaped them both irrevocably. "Why?" Steele asked simply. "Why track down the tank? Why find me?" Al-Saman's expression softened slightly. "To understand, my father wasn't supposed to be there that day. He was a training officer, not a frontline commander. But when his battalion commander was killed the day before, he took command of the remaining tanks. He fought well," Steele acknowledged, the professional assessment coming automatically. "He managed to flank our position, take out one of our tanks. Not many Iraqi commanders accomplished that against the Abrams." A look of surprise crossed Al-Saman's face. "You remember the engagement specifically?" "Every detail," Steele said quietly. "The tank your father destroyed. My best friend was commanding it." Understanding dawned in Al-Saman's eyes. "So that's why you wanted the T-55. It wasn't just any enemy tank to you." "No," Steele admitted. "It wasn't." A silence fell between them, heavy with the weight of their connected past. Finally, Al-Saman spoke again. "Colonel, I didn't come for revenge or confrontation. I came because I think we might both find some peace in talking, in understanding what happened that day from both sides." Steele studied the younger man, searching for deception and finding none. Just a son seeking answers about his father's death, a mirror image, in some ways, of Steele's own quest to make sense of Moore's death. "Would you like to see the tank?" Steele offered suddenly. Al-Saman's eyes widened. "You would show me? It was your father's tank," Steele said simply. "You have as much right to see it as I do." He led Al-Saman through the house and out to the detached garage. As Steele unlocked the door, he realized he was about to share his most private space, his sanctuary and obsession, with the son of the man who'd caused his decades of grief and guilt. The irony wasn't lost on him. The garage door swung open, revealing the partially restored T-55. Al-Saman stopped in the doorway, his breath catching audibly at the sight of the Soviet-made tank. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the vehicle. Steele nodded. "Go ahead." Al-Saman approached the tank slowly, almost reverently. He circled it once, his hand occasionally reaching out to touch the cold steel, before stopping at the commander's hatch. "This is where he would have been," he said softly, when it happened." "Yes," Steele confirmed, joining him beside the tank. "The 120-meter Sabot round would have entered here." He pointed to the repaired hole in the frontal armor. "It would have been instantaneous. He wouldn't have suffered." Al-Saman nodded, absorbing this information. "Thank you for telling me that. Helps somehow. Steele understood. In war's aftermath, details mattered, not for revenge or recrimination, but for closure, for making peace with what couldn't be changed. Your father was a soldier doing his duty, Steele said, as was I. Different sides, different causes, but the same fundamental responsibility, to lead men in battle as best we could. He was more than a soldier, Alsamon said quietly. He was a poet, a teacher. He opposed Saddam privately but believed in defending Iraq from foreign intervention. Complex like most people, he turned to face Steele directly. Just as I imagine your friend was more than just a tank commander. He was, Steele agreed, thinking of Moore's letter, his humor, his dreams for the future that would never be realized. Much more. They stood in silence for a moment, two men connected by tragedy but finding perhaps a measure of understanding in their shared recognition of what had been lost on both sides. What will you do with the tank when you've finished restoring it? Alsamon asked eventually. Donate it to a museum, Steele replied, as an educational exhibit about the human cost of war, about the men inside these machines. Alsamon nodded approval. A worthy purpose. He hesitated, then added, I have some of my father's personal items. His journal from that time, photos. Perhaps they could be part of the exhibit, to show both sides of the story. The offer stunned Steele. That this man, whose father he had killed in combat, would want to collaborate with him, to create something meaningful from their shared tragedy, seemed almost miraculous. I would be honored, he said sincerely. As they walked back to the house, Alsamon mentioned that he needed to return to Phoenix that evening. They exchanged contact information, promising to stay in touch about the museum exhibit. At the front door, Alsamon paused. Colonel, may I ask you one more question? Of course. Do you regret it? Destroying my father's tank that day? Steele considered this question carefully. I regret that your father died, that my friend died, that any of us had to be there that day, fighting someone else's war. He met Alsamon's gaze directly. But in that moment, with my unit under fire, my friend already killed, no, I don't regret doing my duty as a soldier. Alsamon nodded slowly. My father would have given the same answer, I think. He extended his hand. Thank you for your honesty, Colonel, and for showing me the tank. Steele shook his hand firmly. Thank you for coming, for sharing your father's story. After Alsamon departed, Steele stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the visitor's car disappear down the street. The encounter had shaken him profoundly, not with fear or anger, but with a strange sense of connection. For 32 years, the Iraqi tank commander had been a faceless enemy, a necessary target, a footnote in Steele's personal narrative of loss and survival. Now he had a name, a story, a son who mourned him. He had become human in a way war rarely allows enemies to be. When Martha returned from her book club meeting an hour later, she found Steele sitting in the living room, staring at the wall of family photos without really seeing them. Bill, what's wrong? She asked, immediately sensing his disturbance. Slowly, haltingly, Steele recounted his visitor and their conversation. Martha listened without interruption, her expression shifting from alarm to amazement. That's incredible, she said when he finished. How do you feel about it? I don't know, Steele admitted. Part of me feels lighter somehow, like a wound I didn't know was still infected has been lanced. But another part feels even more confused about what it all means. Martha sat beside him, taking his hand. What means? All of it. Desert Storm, Moore's death, the last 30 years of carrying this weight. He shook his head. I've defined myself by that moment for so long, by being the survivor, the one who avenged Moore by destroying that T-55. But now the enemy has a face, Martha finished for him. A story, a son who grieves just as you've grieved for your friend. Yes, Steele squeezed her hand gratefully, and I don't know what to do with that. Maybe you're not supposed to do anything with it, Martha suggested gently. Maybe it's enough just to know it, to let it change how you see the past without needing to solve it or fix it. Steele considered this. Throughout his military career, he'd been a problem solver, analyzing situations, developing strategies, executing missions. The idea of simply sitting with a complex truth, letting it exist without resolution, ran counter to his training. But perhaps that was exactly what healing required. I should call Dr. Kaufman, he said. Tell him about this before I leave for Washington. Martha nodded approval. That's a good idea. This is a lot to process on your own. And I should tell James, Steele added, about the tank, about Moore, about all of it, before we work together on this Ukrainian project. Yes, Martha agreed. No more compartmentalizing your life. No more carrying burdens alone. That evening, after a lengthy phone session with Dr. Kaufman, Steele felt emotionally drained but strangely peaceful. The psychiatrist had helped him begin to integrate this new perspective into his understanding of the past, not erasing or diminishing his grief over more, but expanding his awareness of the war's impact on all involved. This is significant progress, Colonel, Dr. Kaufman had said toward the end of their call. Meeting Mr. Alsamon, hearing his father's story, showing him the tank, these are powerful steps toward reconciliation, not just with the past, but with yourself. Now, as Steele prepared for bed, his mind turned to the upcoming Pentagon assignment. How would this new perspective influence his approach to training Ukrainian forces? Would it make him more hesitant, less effective, or would it add a dimension of humanity to his technical expertise, a deeper understanding of what was truly at stake? The answer came to him as he drifted towards sleep. His experience made him not less qualified for this mission, but more so. Who better to teach these Ukrainian tank crews than someone who understood not only the technical capabilities of their equipment, but the human cost of employing it? Who better to prepare them for the battlefield's moral complexities than someone who had lived with those complexities for decades? In the darkness, Steele felt a sense of purpose solidifying within him. This mission wasn't just about tactics and specifications. It was about passing on the hard-won wisdom of his experience, all of it, including the grief, the guilt, the recognition of shared humanity across battle lines. He thought of Moore's letter, of their pact to live a life big enough for two. Perhaps this was part of what that meant, to transform personal tragedy into something meaningful, something that might help others navigate their own crucibles of combat and conscience. For the first time in years, Colonel William Steele fell asleep without dreading the nightmares that might come. And for the first time in memory, he didn't dream of desert battlefields and burning tanks, but of a future where even the most painful chapters of his past served a purpose greater than himself. The following day passed in a flurry of preparation. Steele packed for his trip to Washington, organized his research materials, and made arrangements for Martha to manage things at home during his absence. In the late afternoon, they drove to the restaurant where they were meeting Sarah for dinner. Their daughter had chosen an upscale steakhouse in downtown Las Vegas, a neutral territory that wasn't their home, but still offered the privacy they would need for what promised to be an emotional conversation. Sarah was already seated when they arrived. At 35, she was a striking blend of both parents, Martha's blonde hair and Steele's intense blue eyes, her mother's compassionate nature tempered by her father's precision and drive. Her success as a trauma surgeon seemed almost predestined, combining Martha's nurturing instincts with Steele's ability to function under pressure. She stood to embrace her mother warmly, then turned to Steele. Their hug was briefer, more hesitant, a physical manifestation of the distance that had grown between them over the years. "Dad," she said, studying him as they sat down, "you look different." "Different how?" Steele asked, genuinely curious. Sarah tilted her head slightly, considering. "Less tense, maybe, more present." Martha smiled knowingly. A lot has happened in the past few days. Over appetizers, they caught up on Sarah's life. Her work at the Seattle Trauma Center, her recent publication in a prestigious medical journal, her ongoing relationship with a fellow surgeon named Michael. "You should bring him to visit sometime," Martha suggested. "We'd love to meet him." "Maybe," Sarah replied noncommittally, her eyes flickering to Steele. The unspoken message was clear. She was hesitant to bring someone important into the complicated dynamics of their family. Steele cleared his throat. "Sarah, I owe you an apology." She looked startled. "For what?" "For not being the father you deserved." Steele maintained eye contact, forcing himself to face her surprise and skepticism. "I've been absent, even when physically present, trapped in my own past, my own issues. You deserve better." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Mom told me about your therapy sessions, about the consulting job." "Yes," Steele nodded, "but there's more you should know, about why I've been the way I have been, about Desert Storm, about my friend David Moore, about the tank in my garage." As their entrees arrived, Steele began the story he should have told years ago. He spoke of Moore, of their friendship, of the fateful day in the Iraqi desert. He explained about the T-55 and his decades-long obsession with it. He told her about finding Moore's letter, about his promise to live a life big enough for two, and finally he shared the extraordinary story of Tariq al-Saman's visit. Sarah listened intently, her food growing cold as Steele's narrative unfolded. When he finished, she sat in silence for a long moment, processing everything she'd heard. "Why didn't you ever tell me any of this before?" she asked finally, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was protecting you," Steele admitted, "from my pain, from the uglier realities of what I experienced in combat. But I realize now that my silence didn't protect you. It just created a wall between us." Sarah nodded slowly. "I always knew there was something. Some reason you were so distant, so controlled. I used to think it was me, that I disappointed you somehow." "No," Steele said emphatically, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Never that. You have always made me incredibly proud, Sarah. My issues were never about you. They were about my own inability to process what I'd experienced, to integrate it into who I was as a father, as a husband." Tears glistened in Sarah's eyes. "I wish I'd known about Uncle David. That's what you called him when I was little, right? I have vague memories of you talking about him." "Yes," Steele confirmed, his own eyes misting. "He was like a brother to me. He would have been your godfather if he'd lived." "And now you're going to Washington, then Europe," Sarah said, shifting topics slightly, "to train Ukrainians on tanks like the one that killed him." "Yes," Steele nodded. "It feels right somehow. Using what I know, what I've learned, even the painful parts, to help others." Sarah studied him thoughtfully. "That sounds like healing to me, Dad. Using your wound as a source of wisdom, not just pain." The comment struck Steele deeply. "That's exactly it," he agreed, surprised and moved by her insight. "That's what I'm trying to do now." Sarah reached for her wine glass, lifting it slightly. "To Uncle David, then, and to you finding a way to honor him that brings life, not more suffering." They touched glasses, the simple toast binding them in a moment of shared understanding that felt like the beginning of a new chapter in their relationship. As they finished their meal, the conversation turned to practical matters: Steele's departure schedule, Martha's plans during his absence, the possibility of Sarah visiting while he was away. "Actually," Sarah said hesitantly, "I was thinking I might come to visit you in Europe, if that's possible. Maybe bring Michael. Make it a chance for you to meet him and for us to spend some time together somewhere new." The offer caught Steele by surprise. For years, Sarah had maintained a careful distance, their interactions limited to obligatory holiday visits and occasional phone calls. This suggestion of voluntary time together, of wanting to introduce her partner to him, felt like a precious gift. "I'd like that very much," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Sarah smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression that had been absent for too long. "Good, let's plan on it then." As they parted in the restaurant parking lot, Sarah's hug was different, longer, tighter, more reminiscent of the embraces they'd shared when she was a child and still looked at her father as her hero. "I love you, Dad," she whispered. "Be safe over there." "I love you too, sweetheart," Steele replied, holding her close. "Thank you for listening, for understanding." "I'm a trauma surgeon," Sarah said as she pulled away, wiping a tear. "Understanding wounds is what I do, even the invisible ones." Driving home with Martha, Steele felt another piece of his fragmented life fitting back into place. His relationship with Sarah wasn't fully healed. Too many years of distance couldn't be overcome in a single dinner. But they'd made a start, an opening, a path forward. "That went well," Martha observed, reaching across to squeeze his knee. "Better than I expected, honestly." "Me too," Steele admitted. "I should have done it years ago." "We can't change the past, Bill," Martha reminded him gently. "But it's never too late to change the future." The wisdom of her words settled over him like a benediction. He couldn't undo the decades of emotional isolation, the walls he'd built around his trauma, the opportunities for connection he'd missed with his daughter. But he could choose a different path now, one of openness, vulnerability, and purpose. Back home, as they prepared for bed, Steele's phone chimed with an email alert. The Pentagon had sent his final travel instructions for Monday, along with a preliminary agenda for his first week of consultations. "It's really happening," he said to Martha, showing her the schedule. "Are you ready?" she asked. Steele considered the question seriously. Was he ready to step back into the world of military operations, even in an advisory capacity? Was he ready to apply his expertise, including his hard-won insights into the human dimensions of armored warfare, to a conflict with very real stakes? Was he ready to honor Moore's memory, not through private obsession, but through meaningful service? "Yes," he said finally. "I think I am." Martha kissed him softly. "Then go do what you do best, Colonel. Lead, teach, make a difference. In the darkness of their bedroom, Steele held his wife close, grateful for her understanding, her patience, her unwavering support through all the years of his internal struggles. Tomorrow he would begin final preparations for his journey, practical tasks like checking his luggage, reviewing his documents, securing the house. But tonight he allowed himself to simply be present in this moment of transition. Behind him lay decades of carrying an unspeakable burden alone. Ahead lay an opportunity to transform that burden into something meaningful, something that might save lives in a conflict half a world away. And somewhere, Steele believed, David Moore was raising a toast to his old friend, not for avenging his death or preserving his memory, but for finally finding a way to live that life big enough for two. Colonel William Steele felt the familiar weight of purpose as he strode through the Pentagon's E-ring corridors. 3 days into his consulting assignment, and already the rhythms of military life had enveloped him again. The crisp salutes from young officers recognizing his visitor badge with its retired colonel designation, the precise language of the briefings, the sense of being part of something larger than himself. The conference room where the Ukraine Support Task Force met was secured against electronic surveillance, its walls lined with maps of Eastern Europe and technical diagrams of various tank models, both NATO and Soviet designs. As Steele entered, the 8 other members of the team rose respectfully. "At ease," said Major General Phillips, the task force commander. "Colonel Steele has some insights on T-55 tactical employment I believe you'll all find valuable." Steele moved to the front of the room where a large display showed a topographical map of eastern Ukraine. For the next hour, he detailed how Ukrainian forces could maximize the effectiveness of their upgraded T-55s against more modern Russian armor, using terrain to compensate for technological disadvantages, employing ambush tactics to negate the Russian advantage in range and optics, and leveraging the T-55's low profile for concealment. "The key is to never engage in the type of battle these tanks weren't designed to win," Steele explained, highlighting potential engagement zones on the map. "No frontal assaults against T-90s or T-72B3s. No long-range duels where the Russians' superior fire control systems give them the edge. Instead, focus on what the T-55 does well: close-in support of infantry, ambushes from defensive positions, overwatch of critical terrain features." Captain Jennifer Wilson, an armor branch officer with 3 combat tours in her service record, leaned forward. "Colonel, these tactics sound similar to what we employed with the Abrams in urban environments in Iraq." "Good observation, Captain," Steele nodded. "The principles are similar, though the technical parameters differ. In both cases, you're maximizing your platform's strengths while minimizing its vulnerabilities." As the briefing concluded, General Phillips asked Steele to remain behind while the others filed out. "Impressive work, Colonel," the general said once they were alone. "Your insights go beyond the technical specifications. You understand how these machines function in the real world." "Thank you, sir," Steele replied. "I've had some experience." "So I've heard." Phillips studied him thoughtfully. "Desert Storm, your unit encountered T-55s directly." "Yes, sir. My Abrams platoon engaged approximately 15 T-55s during the ground campaign." Phillips nodded, then asked the question that Steele had been expecting since his arrival. "Is it difficult for you, Colonel, advising on the effective use of the same tanks you once fought against?" Steele considered his answer carefully. A week ago, he might have deflected the question with military stoicism. But his recent experiences, the therapy with Dr. Kaufman, finding Moore's letter, meeting Tariq al-Saman, had shifted something fundamental within him. "It's complex, sir," he admitted. "These tanks represent difficult memories for me personally. But that's precisely why I believe I can offer valuable perspective. I've seen both what these machines can do and what they can't. I've witnessed their limitations and their surprising capabilities." Phillips seemed satisfied with this response. The Ukrainian delegation arrives tomorrow. 6 senior tank officers, all experienced commanders with multiple combat rotations. They'll be eager to hear your assessments. "I'll be ready, sir." "One more thing, Colonel," Phillips added as Steele turned to leave. "Your son, Captain Steele, will be joining us tomorrow as well. He's being temporarily reassigned from EUCOM to serve as our liaison with the training cadre in Germany." Steele felt a surge of emotion he carefully controlled. "I understand, sir. Thank you for informing me." Back in his hotel room that evening, Steele called Martha to share the news about James joining the Pentagon team. "That's wonderful," she said, her voice warm with approval. "How do you feel about working together?" "Nervous," Steele admitted, surprising himself with his candor. It's been a long time since James has seen me in a professional military context. I don't want to overstep or embarrass him. Bill, Martha said gently, James suggested you for this role. He wants to work with you. I know, it's just... Steele searched for words to explain his apprehension. In many ways, he's surpassed me already. Handled more complex operations, dealt with more nuanced geopolitical situations. I don't want him to see me as obsolete. Martha's laugh was soft but genuine. Oh, Bill, for all your tactical expertise, you've missed something obvious. James didn't recommend you despite your age or retired status. He recommended you because of your experience, your institutional knowledge, your perspective that can only come from years of service and reflection. Steele absorbed this insight, recognizing its truth. When did you get so wise about military matters? He asked, a smile on his voice. I've been married to a soldier for 40 years, Martha replied. I've learned a thing or two about warrior psychology. After they hung up, Steele spent the evening reviewing his notes for the Ukrainian delegation. But his thoughts kept drifting to James, to the prospect of working alongside his son as colleagues, not just as father and son. It felt like a gift, an unexpected opportunity to bridge the professional and personal aspects of their relationship that had remained largely separate. The following morning, Steele arrived at the Pentagon earlier than necessary, his old military punctuality asserting itself. As he passed through security, he heard a familiar voice behind him. Permission to approach, Colonel? Steele turned to find James standing at attention, a playful smile contradicting his formal posture. At 38, Captain James Steele had his father's height and bearing, though his features favored Martha more. In his Army service uniform with captain's bars and combat decorations, he cut an impressive figure. Permission granted, Captain, Steele replied, matching the formal tone before breaking into a smile. It's good to see you, son. They embraced briefly, mindful of their surroundings in the Pentagon's public area. How was the flight? Steele asked as they walked toward the E-ring. Long, noisy. Military transport hasn't evolved much since your day, James replied with a grin. How's the consulting work going? Well, I think. General Phillips seems satisfied with my input. The real test comes today with the Ukrainian delegation. James nodded. I met them in Germany last week. Impressive officers. Dedicated, resourceful. They've been fighting for over 2 years now, mostly with outdated equipment against a numerically superior force. Sounds familiar, Steele observed. We faced similar disparities in Desert Storm, though the technology gap was reversed. They paused outside the conference room where they would meet the others. James turned to his father, his expression suddenly serious. Dad, before we go in there, I want you to know I'm proud to be working with you on this. When they asked for recommendations on T-55 expertise, you were the first and only name I suggested. Steele felt a warmth spread through his chest, a pride and gratitude that momentarily threatened his composure. Thank you, James. That means a great deal to me. Just don't tell any embarrassing stories from my childhood, James added with a grin, breaking the emotional tension. No promises, Captain, Steele replied, matching his son's smile as they entered the conference room together. The Ukrainian delegation proved to be everything James had described: professional, experienced, and intensely focused on absorbing every bit of knowledge that might help their forces in the field. The senior officer, Colonel Petro Kovalenko, was a weathered tank commander in his 40s who had fought against Russian forces since 2014, first in the Donbass region and now across a much broader front. After General Phillips made the introductions, Colonel Kovalenko addressed Steele directly. Colonel Steele, we have heard much about your expertise with T-55, he said in accented but fluent English. In Ukraine, we face a situation where we must use older platforms against newer Russian tanks. Any advantage you can help us find may save many lives. I understand, Colonel, Steele replied, and I believe there are significant tactical approaches that can maximize the T-55's effectiveness, particularly the upgraded versions you're receiving. For the next several hours, Steele led an intensive technical discussion. He outlined engagement tactics, maintenance priorities, crew training focuses, and terrain considerations. The Ukrainians listened intently, asking pointed questions that revealed their deep practical knowledge of armored warfare. During a break, Colonel Kovalenko approached Steele privately. You speak of T-55 not just with technical knowledge but with respect, he observed, as if you know this tank personally. Steele hesitated only briefly before responding with honesty. I do know it personally, Colonel. In Desert Storm, my tank platoon fought against Iraqi T-55s. I've seen firsthand both their vulnerabilities and their surprising strengths. Kovalenko's eyes widened slightly. You fought against them, and now you help us use them. This is unexpected. War creates strange ironies, Steele acknowledged. But in this case, I believe my experience from both sides of the engagement gives me useful perspective. The Ukrainian officer studied him thoughtfully. There is more to your story, I think. There is, Steele admitted, but that's for another time, perhaps. For now, let's focus on keeping your crews alive and effective. Kovalenko nodded, respecting the boundary. I would like to hear this story someday. Warrior to warrior. Someday, Steele agreed. As the day's session concluded, General Phillips announced the next phase of their work. In 3 days, the entire team would transfer to the training facility in Germany, where they would work directly with Ukrainian tank crews on the actual upgraded T-55s. James caught up with his father as they left the conference room. That went well. The Ukrainians clearly respect your expertise. They're good officers, Steele replied, focused on what matters, protecting their crews while accomplishing the mission. Dinner tonight? James suggested. There's a decent steakhouse not far from your hotel. I'd like that, Steele agreed. That evening, over steaks and bourbon, father and son spoke more openly than they had in years. The professional context of their reunion had somehow made personal conversation easier, removing the awkwardness that had characterized their civilian interactions. Mom tells me you've been seeing a therapist, James said after they'd covered the day's events and updated each other on family matters. That you're finally dealing with the PTSD. Steele nodded, cutting into his ribeye. Should have done it years ago. Might have been a better father if I had. You were a good father, James countered. Tough sometimes, distant others, but never cruel or indifferent. You taught me integrity, discipline, responsibility, values that have served me well. But I wasn't always present, even when I was physically there, Steele acknowledged. Too caught up in my own battles to fully engage with you or Sarah. James considered this, swirling the bourbon in his glass. You know what I remember most from childhood? The time you took me to the Armored Museum at Fort Knox. I must have been about 10. You knew every tank, every detail. But it wasn't just technical information. You told stories about the men who crewed them, what it felt like inside during combat, the brotherhood that forms in those metal boxes. Steele remembered that day vividly, one of the rare times he'd allowed himself to share his military experience with his son in a way that felt authentic rather than sanitized. That day showed me who you really were, James continued. Not just Colonel Steele, the officer everyone respected and some feared, but Bill Steele, the man who understood that tanks weren't just weapons. They were vessels containing human courage, fear, triumph, and loss. Steele felt a tightness in his throat. I didn't know that day meant so much to you. It's why I became a tanker, James said simply. Not because you pushed me toward it, you never did, but because I wanted to understand that world you revealed to me that day. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the admission settling between them like a bridge connecting two previously separate territories. I should tell you about David Moore, Steele said finally, and about the T-55 in my garage. James listened without interruption as his father recounted the full story. Moore's death in Desert Storm, the decades of guilt and obsession. Finding the letter, meeting Tariq al-Saman. When Steele finished, James sat back, absorbing the revelations. That explains a lot, he said quietly. About you, about why certain anniversaries were always difficult, about the nightmares Mom mentioned but never explained. I should have told you long ago, Steele acknowledged, but I thought I was protecting you from the uglier realities of war. Dad, I've been in combat, I've lost friends, I understand more than you might think. James leaned forward earnestly. But knowing your story, knowing about Uncle David and that pact you made, it helps me understand you better. And the tank restoration project? Does that make more sense now too? It does, James nodded. Though I'm glad you're donating it to a museum instead of keeping it as a private shrine. That feels healthier. Your sister said something similar, Steele remarked, surprised and gratified by his children's similar perspectives. Sarah always was the smarter Steele offspring, James grinned. Then more seriously, Dad, I think this consulting work, helping train the Ukrainians on these same tanks, might be part of honoring that pact too. Taking something painful from your past and using it to potentially save lives. Steele felt a surge of pride in his son's insight. That's exactly what Dr. Kaufman suggested, using the wound as a source of wisdom. They talked late into the evening, covering territory both professional and personal. By the time they parted outside the restaurant, something fundamental had shifted between them. A new foundation of understanding laid upon the bedrock of their shared military experience, but extending far beyond it. Back in his hotel room, Steele called Martha to share the evening's breakthroughs. "It sounds wonderful," she said warmly. "I've been hoping you two would connect like this for years." "We should have had this conversation a decade ago," Steele sighed. "Maybe you weren't ready then," Martha suggested. "Maybe you both needed to reach this point in your lives. James with enough combat experience to truly understand, you with enough distance to finally open up." As always, Martha's perspective brought clarity. "You're probably right. I usually am," she replied with affectionate confidence. "Oh, I almost forgot. Tariq al-Saman called today. He's sending some of his father's personal effects for the museum exhibit. A journal, some photos, even his tank commander's beret." Steele felt a complex emotion at this news. Gratitude mixed with something like reverence for the unexpected connection forged with his former enemy's son. "That's remarkable," he said finally. "Please thank him for me. Tell him I'll call when I return from Germany." "I will. And Bill, I am proud of you. For opening up to James, for doing this work with the Ukrainians, for all of it." After they hung up, Steele sat on the edge of the hotel bed, reflecting on how much had changed in the weeks since finding Moore's letter. The obsession that had consumed him for decades was transforming into something else. Not forgotten or diminished, but channeled toward purpose rather than private pain. Tomorrow would bring more tactical discussions, more preparation for the German phase of the mission. But tonight, Colonel William Steele felt a peace that had eluded him for 32 years. A sense that perhaps he was finally beginning to fulfill his promise to David Moore to live a life big enough for two. 3 days later, the joint American-Ukrainian team arrived at the U.S. Army training facility near Grafenwohr, Germany. The sprawling installation, long used for NATO exercises, now hosted an intensive program to prepare Ukrainian forces for combat with various Western-supplied weapon systems, including the upgraded T-55 tanks. As Steele stepped out of the military transport onto the tarmac, the familiar scent of jet fuel and the distant sound of artillery practice on the range triggered a cascade of memories from his own deployments to Germany during the Cold War. Then, the Soviet threat had been theoretical. Now Russian aggression was a bloody reality for their Ukrainian allies. The following morning, Steele got his first look at the upgraded T-55s the Ukrainian forces would be using. On the massive vehicle park, two distinct variants sat side by side. Czech T-55 AM2s with enhanced armor and fire control systems, and Slovenian M55S models with NATO standard 105mm guns replacing the original 100mm Soviet weapons. Steele walked around the tanks slowly, noting the modifications. These weren't the same machines he'd faced in Desert Storm. The additional reactive armor packages, modern fire control systems, and improved powertrains made them more formidable, though still outmatched by the latest Russian models. "Impressive upgrades," James commented, joining his father beside one of the M55S tanks. "The Slovenian version with the L7 gun can actually penetrate a T-72's frontal armor at close range." "The irony isn't lost on me," Steele replied, running his hand along the 100-foot gun barrel. "British gun design, American-developed ammunition, mounted on a Soviet chassis, operated by Ukrainian crews to fight against Russians. If that doesn't symbolize the complexity of modern warfare, I don't know what does." The Ukrainian tank crews began arriving that afternoon, experienced veterans mixed with newer recruits, all intensely motivated to master their new equipment. Steele watched as they swarmed over the tanks, examining every detail with the focused attention of professionals whose lives would soon depend on these machines. Colonel Kovalenko approached Steele as he observed the crews. "My men are eager to begin training, Colonel. They know time is short." "How long before they need to be operational?" Steele asked. Kovalenko's expression darkened slightly. "Intelligence suggests major Russian offensive in eastern sectors within 6 weeks. These crews must be combat-ready before then." 6 weeks, Steele repeated, mental calculations already forming. "Tight timeline, but doable with the right training progression." "This is why we value your expertise," Kovalenko said, "to compress years of experience into weeks of training." Over the next several days, Steele immersed himself in the training program. He developed specialized tactical exercises focused on maximizing the T-55's strengths in the specific combat environments the Ukrainians faced. He worked directly with crew commanders, sharing insights from his own combat experience against and with similar vehicles. One evening, after a long day on the training ranges, Steele found himself sitting alone in the officers' club, nursing a bourbon and reflecting on the day's progress. The Ukrainian crews were learning quickly, adapting the theoretical knowledge from the Pentagon briefings into practical application in the field. James joined him, setting down his own drink. The range officers say the Ukrainian gunners are hitting targets at 1,800 meters consistently now. Better than expected with these fire control systems. They're motivated learners, Steele observed, and most have actual combat experience, which accelerates the process. They don't need to be convinced of the stakes. Speaking of stakes, James said, his tone shifting, there's something I should tell you. I've been selected for the liaison team that will accompany these tanks to Poland for final preparation before they cross into Ukraine. Steele felt a cold knot form in his stomach. How close to the border? Training center near Rzeszów, about 60 miles from the Ukrainian border. Not combat, Steele reminded himself. Not direct involvement. Still, the proximity to an active war zone sent his paternal instincts into overdrive. Standard rotation? He asked, maintaining his professional demeanor despite his internal concern. 6 weeks on, 2 weeks off, James confirmed. First rotation starts when we finish the training phase here. Steele nodded slowly, processing this information. Your mother will worry. I know, James acknowledged. That's why I wanted to tell you first. Thought you might help me find the right words to reassure her. The request, son seeking father's guidance on a matter both military and personal, touched Steele deeply. I'll help you. But James, she's tougher than either of us gives her credit for. She's been a military wife for 40 years. She understands the risks and responsibilities. Like she understood about your T-55 project, the real reason behind it. Steele conceded the point with a slight nod. We're both learning to be more open with her, with each other. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, each contemplating the evolution of their relationship over these past weeks. Dad, James said finally, there's something else. General Phillips mentioned the possibility of extending your consulting contract, making it a longer-term arrangement, not just for this Ukrainian training mission, but for developing comprehensive tactical doctrines for Allied forces using Soviet-era equipment. Steele hadn't heard this yet. Extended how long? Potentially a year, maybe longer. Split between Pentagon, European training sites, possibly some work with other NATO partners who still use these platforms. The prospect stirred mixed emotions in Steele. On one hand, the work felt meaningful, purposeful, a way to contribute his expertise to a cause he believed in. On the other, it would mean a significant commitment, time away from home just when he and Martha were reconnecting in new ways. I'd need to discuss it with your mother, Steele said. We're supposed to be retiring together, not starting new careers apart. Of course, James agreed. Just thought you should know they're considering it. The Ukrainians specifically requested your continued involvement. Colonel Kovalenko says your insight is invaluable. Steele felt a surge of professional pride at this assessment, tempered by practical considerations. I'll think about it. Talk to Martha. Later that night, in the privacy of his quarters, Steele called home. Martha listened as he explained both James's upcoming assignment near the Ukrainian border and the potential extension of his own consulting role. How do you feel about it? She asked when he'd finished. The longer contract. Conflicted, Steele admitted. The work feels important, necessary. I'm good at it, but it would mean more time apart, more disruption to our retirement plans. Bill, Martha said gently, do you remember what you told me the night you found David's letter? About living a life big enough for two? Yes. Maybe this is part of that. Using your experience to help others, to potentially save lives. She paused. Besides, who says I can't come with you for parts of it? We talked about seeing Europe together. Steele felt a wave of gratitude for her understanding. You wouldn't mind? Mind my husband finding meaningful work that values his expertise and helps a nation fighting for its survival? That makes him feel purposeful instead of dwelling in the past? Martha chuckled. No, Bill, I wouldn't mind. I love you, Steele said simply. I know, Martha replied. Now about James. He's not going into combat, Steele assured her. The training center is in Poland, NATO territory. He'll be 60 miles from the border. That's not as reassuring as you think it is, Martha said dryly. Russian missiles don't respect borders. True, Steele acknowledged, but James is good at what he does. Smart, careful, and this mission matters to him. Like father, like son, Martha sighed. Just promise me you'll keep an eye on him while you're both there. Always, Steele vowed. The training program intensified over the next 2 weeks. The Ukrainian crews progressed from basic operations to advanced tactical exercises, incorporating the specialized engagement approaches Steele had developed. Live fire drills demonstrated the effectiveness of his methodologies, with the upgraded T-55s consistently achieving hit rates comparable to more modern tanks when employing the recommended tactics. One afternoon, Colonel Kovalenko invited Steele to join him in one of the M55S tanks during a tactical exercise. Steele accepted immediately, eager to experience firsthand how the upgraded vehicle performed. Inside the familiar confines of the T-55's fighting compartment, now modified with NATO communications gear and fire control systems, Steele felt an unexpected sense of connection. This was the same basic design as the tank that had killed Moore, the same tank he'd destroyed in return, the same tank he was restoring in his garage back home. Yet here it was, repurposed, upgraded, serving a cause he believed in. As they maneuvered through the training course, Kovalenko glanced at Steele from the commander's position. "You seem comfortable here, Colonel, like returning to an old friend." "Something like that," Steele replied, not mentioning how this particular friend had once been his most bitter enemy. The tank crested a small rise, its diesel engine roaring with the effort. Through the commander's sight, Steele spotted the target array, silhouettes of Russian T-72s and T-90s at varying distances. "Gunner tank, 2 o'clock, swim 200 meters, Kovalenko ordered in Ukrainian, then repeated in English for Steele's benefit. The turret traversed smoothly, far more responsive than the original Soviet hydraulics would have allowed. The upgraded fire control system calculated the ballistic solution, accounting for range, ammunition type, and environmental conditions. "Fire when ready," Kovalenko commanded. The 105mm gun thundered, the tank rocking with the recoil. Through the sight, Steele watched the round strike the target dead center, a hit that would have penetrated a real T-72's side armor at that range. "Good shot," he commented, genuinely impressed by the crew's proficiency. "With your tactics, we make these old tanks dangerous again," Kovalenko said. "This is a valuable lesson. Sometimes the best weapon is not newest technology, but best application of available resources." The observation struck Steele as profoundly relevant not just to warfare but to his own life. He had spent years feeling obsolete, outdated, a relic of earlier conflicts. Yet here he was, applying his experience in ways that remained relevant and potentially life-saving. That evening, the Ukrainian and American teams gathered for a formal dinner, marking the midpoint of the training program. General Phillips had flown in from Washington to assess their progress, bringing news that additional T-55 variants would be arriving from other NATO countries in the coming weeks. During the meal, Colonel Kovalenko rose to offer a toast. "To our American colleagues," he said, raising his glass, "who help us transform old steel into new hope." As glasses clinked around the table, Steele caught James's eye across the room. His son nodded slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement and respect that conveyed more than words could express. After dinner, General Phillips asked Steele to walk with him around the perimeter of the base. "The program is exceeding expectations, Colonel," the general said as they strolled under the clear German night sky. "The Ukrainian crews are adapting your tactical approaches with impressive results." "They're exceptional soldiers," Steele replied, "highly motivated, quick to learn." "Your son mentioned that we've discussed extending your consulting role," Phillips continued. "Have you given it any thought?" "I have, sir. I'd be interested, assuming we can work out a schedule that allows some flexibility. I'm not looking to return to full-time service at this stage of my life." Phillips nodded, understanding. "We can certainly accommodate reasonable parameters. Your expertise is unique, Colonel, not just technical knowledge of these platforms, but practical combat experience against them, and now this experience training allies to use them effectively. That's a rare combination." "Thank you, sir." Steele hesitated, then added, "There's something else I'd like to propose, if I do accept an extended role." "Go on." "The T-55 in my garage, the one I've been restoring. I still plan to donate it to the museum, but I'd like to incorporate it into our training program first. Bring it here, use it as a teaching tool for understanding the basic platform before crews move to the upgraded versions." Phillips considered this. Interesting proposal. Would need some logistical coordination, shipping clearances, but potentially valuable from a training perspective. "It would also complete a circle for me personally," Steele admitted. "Taking something that represented pain and loss, and transforming it into something that helps save lives. The general studied him thoughtfully. I'll have my staff look into it. No promises, but we'll explore the possibility. 2 days later, Steele received confirmation that arrangements could be made to transport his T-55 to Germany as part of the training program. The logistics would be complex: shipping permits, customs declarations, transportation coordination, but the Pentagon considered it worthwhile both for the practical training value and for the symbolic significance. When Steele shared this news with James, his son immediately grasped the deeper meaning. That tank goes from killing your best friend to sitting in your garage as a private obsession to helping train Ukrainians to defend their homeland. That's one hell of a journey, Dad. For both of us, Steele agreed, the tank and me. As the training program entered its final week, Steele found himself reflecting on the remarkable sequence of events that had brought him here. Just months ago, he had been a retired colonel haunted by past trauma, isolating himself in his garage with the very machine that symbolized his deepest wounds. Now he was actively engaged in meaningful work, reconnected with his son, making peace with his history in ways he never thought possible. One afternoon, as he observed a tactical exercise from an elevated platform, Colonel Kovalenko joined him. "Your methods work, Colonel Steele," the Ukrainian officer said, gesturing toward the training field where T-55s were successfully engaging target arrays using the flanking tactics Steele had advocated. "Crews are confident now. They understand limitations of platforms, but also how to maximize advantages." "I'm glad," Steele replied sincerely. "They're quick studies." Kovalenko was quiet for a moment, watching the exercise. Then, "You promised to tell me your story about your personal connection to these tanks. We leave for Poland tomorrow. Perhaps now is time?" Steele hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Yes, I think it is." They moved to a quieter area away from the noise of the exercise. There, Steele shared his story about Desert Storm, about the T-55 that connected past and present. Kovalenko listened intently, his weathered face registering understanding rather than judgment. "This explains much about how you approach training," the Ukrainian said when Steele finished. "For you, these are not just machines. They contain ghosts." "In a way," Steele acknowledged, "but working with your crews, developing these tactics, it's helped me make peace with those ghosts, given them purpose." Kovalenko placed a hand on Steele's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity from one warrior to another. "In my culture, we believe our ancestors watch over us in battle. Perhaps your friend Moore watches over these tanks now, guiding them to protect my country rather than threaten yours." The sentiment, though not aligned with Steele's own spiritual beliefs, nonetheless resonated emotionally. Perhaps there was a kind of poetic justice in the journey of these machines, from Cold War threats to defensive assets for a nation fighting for its freedom. "I'd like to think he would approve," Steele said. "I am certain of it," Kovalenko replied with conviction. "Warriors understand transformation of purpose is essence of military life." The final day of the German phase arrived. The Ukrainian crews would depart the next morning for Poland, where James and the liaison team would continue supporting them as they prepared to deploy the tanks to the front lines. Steele's T-55 was scheduled to arrive within the week, too late for this group, but in time for the next rotation of Ukrainian trainees. A modest ceremony marked the completion of the training program. General Phillips presented Colonel Kovalenko with a ceremonial plaque, while the Ukrainian officer reciprocated with a battle flag signed by all the tank crews. When it came time for final farewells, Kovalenko approached Steele privately. "Colonel, I have something for you." He handed Steele a small wooden box. "From my crew and myself." Steele opened it to find a Ukrainian tanker's medallion, a traditional good luck token carried by their armored forces since the Soviet era. "We have modified tradition," Kovalenko explained. "Normally, medallion carries image of St. George, patron of warriors. This one has two names engraved on back: your friend Moore and my cousin Petro, killed by Russian tank in Donbass in 2014. Steele turned the medallion over, seeing the two names inscribed in Cyrillic and Roman letters. The gesture, connecting his loss with Kovalenko's, American with Ukrainian, past with present, touched him deeply. "Thank you," he said simply, knowing any more elaborate response would fail to convey his genuine appreciation. Kovalenko nodded once, military brevity masking emotion. "When your tank arrives, it will help train next group. This connects us. Your past helps our future." After the Ukrainian contingent departed for Poland, Steele remained in Germany for another week, developing training materials for the next rotation and coordinating the arrival of his T-55. James had gone with the Ukrainian forces, promising to call when possible from the Polish training center. On his final evening before returning to Washington, Steele received a video call from Martha. When he answered, he was surprised to see not just his wife, but Sarah as well, both smiling from their kitchen in Henderson. "Look who came to visit while her father and brother are saving the world," Martha said, her voice warm with affection. "Sarah," Steele greeted his daughter, genuinely pleased. "This is a wonderful surprise." "Thought I'd keep Mom company for a few days," Sarah explained. "Plus, I wanted to see the famous tank garage now that the tank itself is heading to Europe." "How does it look without its centerpiece?" Steele asked. "Strangely empty," Martha admitted, "but in a good way, like a chapter that's closed so a new one can begin." Sarah leaned closer to the camera. "Mom told me about your extended consulting role, Dad about your T-55 becoming part of the training program. I think well, healing is the word that comes to mind." "It feels that way," Steele agreed, moved by his daughter's perception. "Listen," Sarah continued, somewhat hesitantly, "I've been thinking. Michael and I were planning a vacation next month. We could reroute to include a stop in Germany, maybe meet you there if you're still going to be in Europe." The offer, an olive branch from his once distant daughter, filled Steele with gratitude. "I'd like that very much. James mentioned he might get leave around the same time. Maybe we could have a family reunion of sorts, without the tank as the guest of honor," Martha added with gentle humor. They spoke for nearly an hour, making tentative plans for the European visit, sharing news of home, discussing the Ukrainian training program in general terms that didn't breach security protocols. Throughout the conversation, Steele was struck by how naturally they communicated now. The walls of reticence and resentment that had separated them for years seemingly dissolved by his newfound openness. After ending the call, Steele stepped outside his quarters into the cool German evening. Stars speckled the sky above the training facility, the distant sounds of vehicles and soldiers creating a familiar ambient soundtrack to military life. He reached into his pocket, feeling the Ukrainian tanker's medallion Kovalenko had given him. The weight of it was reassuring, a physical connection to the meaningful work he'd been doing, to the unlikely journey that had brought him here. Tomorrow, he would fly to Washington for debriefings at the Pentagon before returning to Germany for the arrival of his T-55 in the next phase of the training mission. Then potentially months more of this consulting role, helping transform Soviet-era weapons into defensive assets for a nation fighting for its survival. None of this had been in his retirement plans. None of it had been foreseeable when he'd been haunted by nightmares, isolated in his garage with the tank that symbolized his deepest trauma. Yet here he was, his expertise valued, his experience relevant, his past pain becoming a source of wisdom that might help others survive. Steele thought of David Moore's letter, of their pact to live a life big enough for two. For decades, he had failed that promise, retreating into himself rather than embracing life with twice the passion. But perhaps it wasn't too late. Perhaps this unexpected chapter, consulting, teaching, connecting with James professionally and Sarah personally, was the beginning of fulfilling that long-ago oath. The thought brought a sense of peace that had eluded him for 32 years. Not an end to grief or a forgetting of loss, but a transformation of it into something meaningful. Something that honored Moore's memory by truly living rather than merely surviving. Colonel William Steele took a deep breath of the cool night air, feeling more whole than he had since that fateful day in the Iraqi desert. The T-55 would always be part of his story, the machine that had taken his friend, haunted his dreams, occupied his retirement, and now, incredibly, was becoming a tool for saving lives rather than taking them. Some might call it redemption, but Steele preferred a different word: purpose. The tank had found a new one, and so had he. 6 weeks later, Steele stood on the observation platform at the Grafenvohr training range, watching as his restored T-55, now designated as a training vehicle, participated in tactical exercises with the newest rotation of Ukrainian crews. The familiar olive-green machine moved with purpose across the muddy terrain, its diesel engine growling with effort as it executed the flanking maneuvers he had designed. Beside him stood Martha, bundled against the German spring chill, but smiling as she watched the tank in action. She had arrived the previous day, the first step in their planned European tour that would include meeting Sarah and her boyfriend in Prague the following week. James was due for leave in 10 days, completing what would be their first full family gathering in nearly 5 years. So that's it, Martha said, gesturing toward the T-55, the tank that's been your obsession all these years. That was my obsession, Steele corrected gently. Now it's just a training tool, a useful one. Martha studied the tank thoughtfully. It looks different than I expected, smaller somehow. Most people have that reaction, Steele nodded. Movies make tanks seem larger than they are. In reality, they're cramped, claustrophobic. That's part of what creates the bond between crews. 4 men sharing a metal box under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Like you and David Moore, Martha observed. Yes. Steele placed his arm around her shoulders. Thank you for coming here, for understanding why this matters to me. I'm beginning to understand a lot of things, Martha replied, leaning into him, including why you need to continue this work. Below them, the T-55 completed its exercise, rolling to a stop at the designated rally point. The Ukrainian crew emerged from the hatches, their expressions reflecting satisfaction with their performance. They had no idea of the tank's history, of its journey from Iraqi battlefield to American garage to European training ground. To them, it was simply a valuable platform for learning tactics that might soon save their lives in combat. And that, Steele realized, was as it should be. The tank's past, like his own, mattered less now than what it could contribute to the future. Ready to go? Martha asked as the exercise concluded. You promised me dinner in that medieval town you found. Ready, Steele confirmed, taking one last look at the T-55 before turning away. As they walked toward the base exit where a car waited to take them to the nearby historic village, Steele felt the Ukrainian medallion in his pocket, the one bearing Moore's name alongside a Ukrainian soldier's. He carried it always now, a reminder of connections forged across time and conflict, of wounds transformed into wisdom, of promises kept in unexpected ways. Colonel William Steele had spent decades haunted by a tank that symbolized his greatest loss. Now that same tank had become an instrument of his healing, and potentially the survival of soldiers fighting for their homeland half a world away from where his own battle had been fought. Some might call it irony. Steele called it purpose. The tank had found a new one, and so had he.